Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're in session 5 of our new series entitled The QME Report, the Compliance, Credibility, and Persuasiveness Checksheet. And in this program, I'm sharing with you dozens and dozens of ways to improve the content and the quality of your QME report for the express purpose that it can be better used by the parties in the system who use the Qualified Medical Evaluator's report to resolve disputed issues within the workers' compensation system. And it's interesting, I want to share a story with you. I was recently at a meeting of what are referred to as stakeholders in the workers' compensation system. Stakeholders. These groups of people are termed stakeholders. And at the stakeholders meeting, the parties, the stakeholders, were talking about some new rules, laws, regulations, and changes to the QME regulations to somehow, some way, eke out of qualified medical evaluators better reports. In other words, they were discussing how to squeeze blood from a stone and get better report quality out of qualified medical evaluators. And as I sat there listening to the stakeholders discuss how qualified medical evaluation reports could be better, I had a realization that as a qualified medical evaluator myself, I had very little knowledge as to the roles and duties of other players, other stakeholders in the workers' compensation system. And the stakeholders at this particular meeting consisted of claims administrators, in other words, claims payers, lien representatives, there were attorneys, there was defense attorneys there were qualified medical evaluators there were some lobbyists there, if you can believe that. In other words, all these players and stakeholders in the system had something to say about how qualified medical evaluators' reports could better serve their particular needs in the carrying out of their own unique roles and duties within the workers' compensation system. So an interesting revelation that I had at the time was that the QME report is not written for the QME. The QME report does not serve the QME. The QME does not use the QME report to resolve issues or for any particular purpose in the workers' compensation system. It's other parties in the system that use the QME's report. So that's one point that I wanted to share with you, is that we as qualified medical evaluators have very little knowledge as to the roles and duties and needs of the other stakeholders in the system. So that's point number one. Point number two is I realized also that the other stakeholders have very little knowledge of each of the others' roles and duties, particularly have very little knowledge or understanding or even compassion for the roles and duties of the qualified medical evaluator as to begin with. But secondarily, they had very little knowledge as to the roles and duties of each of the other stakeholders in the meeting. And let me illustrate this point to you. At one point in the discussion, there was a question raised by one of the parties as to an idea as to how QME reports could potentially be better. And that idea had to do with having the qualified medical evaluator's report, after it went through the rating process at the Disability Evaluation Rating Unit, having the DEU rater's report returned back to the qualified medical evaluator so that the qualified medical evaluator could see how the opinions and conclusions in his or her report actually played out in terms of constructing the final disability rating and the final disbursement of actual monies to the injured worker. So the idea was to educate qualified medical evaluators as to how their report impacts the examinee's permanent disability rating. And as we tossed this idea around between the stakeholders at the meeting, it became quickly clear that the stakeholders at the meeting had no knowledge of the operations of the disability evaluation unit. And so we went back and forth asking each other questions and posing potential possible answers, speculative answers as to how the disability evaluation unit handled the qualified medical evaluators report and how they issued their ratings and their summary rating determinations and all that stuff. And I realized that it would be a good idea to have the disability evaluation unit communicate with the qualified medical evaluator, because not only does the qualified medical evaluator not know what goes on down at the DEU, neither did any of the stakeholders at the stakeholders meeting. And so that perfectly illustrated the point that I'm sharing with you in this entire discussion, and that is, at the stakeholders meeting, this high-level meeting of high-level players, even these players have no knowledge of the roles and needs and duties of the other players in the system. And in my opinion, that's probably the most operative and critical aspect of qualified medical evaluators' currently low quality reports, and that has to do with the fact that qualified medical evaluators are not aware as to the needs of the other parties in the qualified medical evaluation report in order to resolve issues within the workers' compensation system. So in today's discussion, I want to share with you some of the needs of some of the other parties in the system, and I want to share with you even some more ways that you can take your reports over the top and make them infinitely better in being able to resolve disputed issues once and for all in the workers' compensation system. Okay, so with that as our introduction, let's just begin today's discussion by reminding ourselves what constitutes and what qualifies as what is referred to in the industry now as a high quality QME report. And a high quality QME report is to be distinguished from its opposite, and its opposite is a low quality report. So as we talk about what constitutes a high quality report, I want you to think about how your QME reports stack up against this new standard. So to begin with, all reports to constitute high quality must have a minimum basic standard, a minimum basic formatting. And that minimum basic formatting has long been established in California Code of Regulation 10606. So 10606 is not new. It's not new. It's been the standard for the construction of qualified medical evaluation reports for decades, as far as my memory goes back. But it's now being resurrected as the new applicable standard that's actually going to be enforced for the first time. So all reports must comply with the minimum formatting guidelines as established in CCR 10606, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue today. So that has to do with the construction, the framework of the qualified medical evaluating report. And then secondarily, in order to constitute a high quality report, the internal content, the words within the qualified medical evaluators report, okay, once the framework and the structure of the report is established through 10606, the framework, then the framework needs to be populated with words and content that meet their own minimum standard. And that own minimum standard is that the opinions and conclusions in the report must meet the minimum standard of what's referred to as substantial medical evidence. Because only opinions and conclusions that meet the minimum standard qualify as opinions and conclusions that can be used to prove or disprove a disputed fact. So remember that the reason that we hire you as a qualified medical evaluator is because there has arisen some type of a disputed medical fact that requires a medical determination from a medical evaluator, which is you. So we hire you to resolve disputes. Well, your opinions and conclusions in your report can only resolve disputes when your opinions and conclusions rise to the minimum standard of substantial medical evidence, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue in today's discussion as well. So for the remainder of today's discussion, let's focus in on two things. Let's focus in on CCR 10606, and I want to share with you what is now being circulated amongst the stakeholders as a check sheet that all QME reports are going to be checked against to make sure that they comply with the minimum framework standards described in CCR 10606. So I'll show you the actual check sheet that's now being developed. And then I want to share with you some ideas about the frustrations that the parties who use our reports have when it comes to the QME report, and how the parties, after dealing with hundreds and hundreds and thousands and years and decades of low-quality QME reports, how the parties are just tearing their hair out in attempts to get qualified medical evaluators to produce higher quality reports, which, as I said earlier, is akin to trying to squeeze blood from a stone when the qualified medical evaluator does not understand the needs of the parties who use the QME report. So I want to share with you some insight in this particular case from the defense attorney and the defense attorney's perspective. Okay, so let's begin by going over the check sheet that has to deal with minimum QME report formatting. Okay, so here we have the very latest version of what's referred to as the Report Quality Review Matrix. Okay, now this is a document in progress, and this may or may not be the final version of this document, but this is the state of development of the document that we have up to this particular moment in time. And so let's go through this and let's read this together. It says that it's the goal of the DWC to provide all medical legal evaluators with ongoing guidance and education throughout their years of service to the California Workers' Compensation System. The Report Quality Review Matrix is a fundamental communication tool aimed at exceeding that goal. Your report quality review is just one component of a continuous improvement initiative focused on providing accurate reports that help move an injured worker's claim to the most appropriate conclusion for both the injured worker and his or her employer. And one of the criticisms of the current low-quality QME reports is that those reports fail to help move the injured worker's claim to its conclusion. Low-quality reports stall the progression of the claim to a conclusion, and it's the stalling of the claims that create unnecessary delays and unnecessary and huge costs to all parties within the system. Well, the intent of the division's report quality initiative is in educating evaluators how to write better reports. The purpose is to educate. Okay? It's not to be used for punitive or punishment or disciplinary proceedings, but rather they're to be used to educate and help improve evaluators' reports. Therefore, the results of this quality review are confidential and will not be used as evidence of wrongdoing regarding any complaints, violations of QME ethics, or any disciplinary proceedings. Okay? So you can relax in knowing that at least this part of the report quality review has as its purpose education versus discipline. So the matrix is based on CCR section 10606. The requirements of 10606 are the fundamental building blocks that must be addressed to the extent applicable in every medical legal report. And then there's some quotation here from 10606. They go on to tell us that the evaluator's intent and expertise producing a high-quality medical legal report must result in written evidence that constitutes substantial medical evidence. To the extent each component applies to a specific case, all of these components that we're going to go over here in just a minute must be found in each report. So here the Report Quality Initiative is going to address two components of a high-quality report. Number one is framework, which they refer to as the fundamental building blocks. The fundamental building blocks of 10606, and then the content of the report and whether or not the content of the report constitutes substantial medical evidence. Okay? So first, with regards to CCR 10606, the report is just going to be checked for the presence or absence of each of the components that are described in 10606. So number one, does the report contain the date of the evaluation and the location that the evaluation was conducted at? Does it describe the history of the injury? Does it provide the patient's complaints? I would perhaps refer to this as the examinees, since these are not patients, correct? Refer to that as the examinee's complaints. With regards to the review of records, does the report contain a listing of all information received in preparation of the report or relied upon for the formulation of the physician's opinion? And this is referring to the review of records, which we've discussed at great length in our previous session in this same program. Does the report contain a description of the examinee's medical history, including injuries and conditions, and any residuals thereof, if any? Does it contain all the findings on physical examination? Does it contain a diagnosis or multiple diagnoses as applicable? Does it provide an opinion as to the nature, extent, and duration of disability and work limitations, if any? Does it describe the cause of the disability? Does it discuss treatment, including past treatment, continuing treatment, and or future medical care? And of course, not all of these will be applicable to every single circumstance. For example, if the examinee is not permanent and stationary, future medical care may or may not be applicable. Okay? Does it contain an opinion as to whether permanent disability has resulted from the injury and whether or not it is stationary? If it's permanent and stationary, does it include a description of the disability with a complete evaluation? Does it provide, in those cases where there is disability or impairment, does it provide an opinion as to the apportionment of the disability? Does it include a determination of the percentage of total causation resulting from actual events of employment? If the injury is alleged to be a psychiatric injury, as we know, for psychiatric injuries, the total causation must be greater than 51% industrial. And here is where the substantial medical evidence comes into play. Does the report contain the reasons for all of the opinions of the medical evaluator? This is going to be a critical section to assess the substantiability of the report. And then does it contain the mandatory disclosures such as a penalty of perjury declaration? Does it disclose the name and qualifications of each person who performed any services in connection with the report? Does it contain the signature of the physician, the date of the signature, and the county in which the report was signed? And those are all just basic framework formatting requirements referred to as the fundamental building blocks described in CCR 10606. So you see how this check sheet is set up. It's set up first to assess the compliance with 10606, and then after that it goes on to discuss some minimum standard for substantial medical evidence in connection with the opinions and conclusions of the report. So for example, for permanent and stationary status, number one, first of all, was it addressed? And then number two, did the evaluator explain why and how and why he or she came to her conclusion, number one, that the examinee's condition was permanent and stationary, and I would add in this as well, did the evaluator explain how and why he or she came to the conclusion as to the date of the permanent and stationary condition. So does the evaluator explain how and why the examinee is permanent and stationary, number one? And then number two, how and why the evaluator arrived at the permanent and stationary date. Two things in order to qualify the permanent and stationary opinion as substantial medical evidence. Number two, did the examiner discuss the employee's work restrictions? And did the evaluator explain how and why they arrived at the particular work restrictions that they provided? And then finally, did the physician complete the return to work voucher report as required for the first evaluator who declares the examinee to be permanent and stationary? So if that's you as the qualified medical evaluator, this is your obligation to provide this report to accompany your qualified medical evaluation report, and this will be a checkbox that will be assessed against your report. For causation, was causation addressed, and did the evaluator explain the how and why of their conclusion? In other words, for industrial causation, it's not enough to simply say, in my opinion, the injury is industrial or something similar like that. You have to explain how and why and what are the reasons that you use to rely on to opine either yes for an industrial injury or no against an industrial injury. And this is how the report reviewer is going to determine whether or not your opinion on causation qualifies as substantial medical evidence. Same thing for impairment. Was it addressed? Did the evaluator explain the how and why of their conclusion? That will also go for Alvarez and Guzman and alternative impairment ratings. Was it addressed? And did the evaluator explain the how and why as to how they arrived at an alternative impairment rating and why they feel that an alternative impairment rating is more accurate than the strict impairment rating? Same holds for apportionment. Was apportionment addressed? Did the evaluator explain the how and why? Future medical care, was it addressed? Did the evaluator explain how and why? And then finally, with regards to the cover letters, the report reviewer is going to ascertain, number one, was a cover letter from one or both parties received by the evaluator prior to the date of the evaluation? And if that is the case, did the evaluator address all questions submitted by the cover letters? And let me just tell you, this is a big deal for the parties and the stakeholders in the system, because their main complaint about low quality QME reports is that the reports do not address the questions contained within the cover letters that are submitted to the qualified medical evaluator. And can you imagine the frustration of the parties? They send you a cover letter with 10 questions for you to address in the course of your evaluation of the examinee, and lo and behold, when the report is finally received by the parties, they notice that none of their questions not a single one of their questions are adequately answered within the body of the QME report. And so as we continue in today's discussion, I want to share with you now some of the frustration of the parties who find that their questions are not adequately addressed in the cover letters, and that the parties themselves are generally finding that the Qualified Medical Evaluator's report is not a high quality report, but rather is a low quality report. And I want to share with you some of the extensive gyrations that the parties are going through in order to try and squeeze blood from a stone and squeeze better content out of the Qualified Medical Evaluator, who really has no knowledge as to how his or her report, is being used by the parties. So what I want to share with you now is a cover letter from a defense attorney who is attempting to communicate to the Qualified Medical Evaluator. Okay, so let's go over a cover letter now. And what I want to share with you today is a cover letter from a defense attorney who apparently has about had it up to here with low quality Qualified Medical Evaluators reports, and who is attempting to do his or her own part to squeeze better report quality out of the Qualified Medical Evaluator. Now, when you receive a cover letter from one or the other of the parties, the cover letter is going to be asking you a series of questions that you are supposed to be able to answer as a result of your evaluation of the examinee. And what the cover letters are going to ask you are, they're going to ask you for your opinions and conclusions on gray area aspects of the evaluation. So for example, you will not expect the cover letter to ask you specifically, what is the examinee's finding on Kemp's test? Okay. The cover letter will not ask you, what was the examinee's range of motion in cervical right rotation? Okay. The cover letters are going to be asking you questions that require that you assimilate all of the physical examination findings, all of the findings from the history of the examinee, all of the findings from the review of records, all of the findings from the diagnostic studies. That the cover letter is going to ask you that you take all of these findings and put them into your mixing bowl of medical decision making, put it on stir, blend at high speed, and come out with a finished product, which is your opinions and conclusions on the gray area aspects of the case. So when it comes to opining on the gray area aspects of the case, your opinions and conclusions must meet a certain minimum standard, which is the standard of substantial medical evidence. So the cover letters are going to ask you to address questions for which your answers, unlike your answer on cervical rotation specific measurements, unlike that type of a factual answer, your answers must all qualify as substantial medical evidence. So in order for your opinions and conclusions to qualify as substantial medical evidence, let's go through the recipe of substantial medical evidence. Number one, they must be based on reasonable medical probability. Now, this is probably the most easy aspect of this recipe to satisfy. You simply predicate your opinion on reasonable medical probability. You do that by stating, for example, whatever the question from the cover letter is, whatever that question is, you answer by stating, in my opinion, comma, within reasonable medical probability, comma, and then state your opinion. This is how you construct the response to the question within the body of your report. In my opinion, comma, within reasonable medical probability, comma, and then you state your opinion. But before you state your opinion, make sure that your opinion can be stated within reasonable medical probability. In other words, is your opinion reasonably medically probably correct? Does it have a greater than 51% likelihood of being correct? This is a low standard, but if your opinion does not even meet this standard, do not provide the opinion. Change your opinion to an opinion that you feel more comfortably meets the 51% or greater likelihood of being correct threshold. Okay? Number 2, the opinion must be based on relevant facts. So whenever you provide an opinion or conclusion in your report, always ask yourself, or even make a list, a hard copy list, of the facts upon which your opinion is based. The more voluminous and the more compelling are the facts upon which your opinion is based, the more substantial is the opinion. If you don't have relevant facts to support the opinion, it's likely that the opinion is not correct because it has no basis. Okay? Number 3, the opinion must be based on an adequate history and an adequate physical examination. And if I was a defense attorney, this is where I would attack the qualified medical evaluators' opinions and conclusions. First and foremost, I would attack the physical examination. And I would look for areas within the physical examination where the physical examination procedures do not comply with the AMA guides. If the physical examination procedures do not comply exactly with the requirements in the AMA guides, then that is a physical examination that is considered to be an inadequate, the opposite of adequate examination. So whenever you provide an opinion or conclusion, always ask yourself, does my physical examination findings support this opinion? Is this opinion supported by relevant facts from the history? Do I have the history? Do I have the facts in the history to support this opinion and conclusion? And so this makes a case for always striving to perform better in the history-taking portion of your face-to-face interview and performing better in the physical examination section of the face-to-face evaluation. The opinion must set forth the reasoning behind his or her conclusions. It must set forth your reasons. You must have reasons for providing the opinion and conclusion that you provide. Sometimes I talk to qualified medical evaluators who are intent on providing a particular opinion or conclusion, and when I ask them, what are your reasons in support of that opinion or conclusion, they are unable to elaborate on the reasons as to why they opine in the way that they do. And every opinion that you offer must be based on reasons. And you do this in the body of your report by phrasing it as follows. In my opinion, comma, within reasonable medical probability, comma, cite your opinion, period. And then you say, reasons for this conclusion include colon, and then list the reasons in support of your opinion or conclusion. And the more voluminous and the more compelling are the reasons, the more likely correct and accurate is your opinion and conclusion, because the opinion and conclusion is more substantial. It's an opinion that is substantial medical evidence. It's more substantial. More substantial opinions are opinions that are based on facts, that are based on reasonable medical probability, that are based on an adequate exam, on an adequate history, that have multiple and compelling reasons. Those are the correct opinions and conclusions for the case because they have the most support. They're the most substantial. Finally, the opinion cannot be based on conjecture, surmise, speculation, or guess. And as you go through your opinions and conclusions, ask yourself, am I speculating here? Am I speculating here? Is there any portion of my opinion that is not based on facts? Is there any portion of my opinion that I cannot back up with a reason? If you don't have a reason for your opinion or conclusion, or even any aspect of your opinion or conclusion, it's likely that that aspect of the opinion or conclusion is based on speculation. So take your opinions and conclusions through this check sheet to determine the substantiability of your opinions and conclusions. Okay? So this is what the parties are looking for. And let me share with you now some exact phrases from a recent cover letter that I received, wherein the defense attorney is intent and adamant that I, as the qualified medical evaluator, do my job in helping him to resolve the disputed issues in the case. Okay, so let's take a look at that particular cover letter. Okay, so let's go over this cover letter. And this is an actual cover letter that came from the defense attorney. So I'll show that to you here. It says Defendant Panel QME Cover Letter. And I have it redacted, of course. And what I want to share with you out of this cover letter has to do with the defense attorney's attempt to get the qualified medical evaluator to respond in such a way that the defense attorney can actually use the finished product of the QME's report. Now, if the QME just goes about his business doing QME type of work, thinking about only the QME, a finished product of the QME report will likely not satisfy the needs of the parties. So in an attempt to create and take some control over the process, the defense attorney poses some very specific instructions to the qualified medical evaluator. So let me read some of those to you. So in the first paragraph of this cover letter, he starts off with a standard templated script. He says, thank you for agreeing to evaluate Mrs. Jones on such and such a date. Enclosed you'll find the cover letters. And then in bold, in this section here in bold, I want to show that to you right here. In this bolded section of the first paragraph, he makes his first request. He says in bold, further, the parties require answers to specific questions provided throughout this letter, as we want to work with you to provide us with a report that will constitute substantial medical evidence before the Workers' Compensation Tribunal, period. Please carefully review and respond to same. Okay? Now, why do you think it is that the defense attorney took the time and found it necessary to create in the first paragraph in bold this request to the qualified medical evaluator to please, please, please. The defense attorney is begging the qualified medical evaluator, please, please answer the questions in the report, and would you please provide answers that constitute substantial medical evidence. The reason that the defense attorney has taken this step is because this defense attorney has experience with low quality reports that have only caused delays and unnecessary costs to him and his particular company and to the entire case in chief in general. Okay? So then he goes on to list in this lower section here what he refers to as the report requirements. Last paragraph of this page. He lists some report requirements. He says, in bold, again, this is in bold, it is requested that you provide the basis for your opinions on all issues. Provide the basis. In other words, please qualify your opinions and conclusions as substantial medical evidence. He's begging. He's begging. In another paragraph, after he asks for the fact that we take a careful and detailed history in order to qualify as substantial medical evidence must be based on an adequate history and adequate physical examination. So he's asking us to take an adequate history. Then he says, again in bold, here in this paragraph, right here I have it highlighted. In bold, he says, you must provide a listing of tests that have been performed or ordered and then received, comma, the results of the tests, comma, and an analysis of what the results mean for this injured worker. And this is so important, and this is so important. I want to ask you, I myself want to beg you, that when you are going through symptom questionnaires, for example, when you're going through physical examination findings, for example, when you're going through diagnostic study findings, always provide the reader with your analysis of what this means. So, for example, at the end of your cervical spine examination section in your physical examination, if you provide the reader of the report with a little section that summarizes your physical examination of the cervical spine and what your findings mean in terms of this examinee's particular condition. In other words, the reader of the report doesn't know what 77/80 right rotation for the cervical spine means. The reader of the report does not know what a positive for localized non-radiating cervical spine pain on right shoulder depressor test, what that means. They're counting on you to provide an analysis of what this means in terms of this particular examinee. So this defense attorney is begging for the qualified medical evaluator to do a thorough analysis and to provide the reader of the report, which is in this case is him, with what these results mean for the injured worker. He says, in the next paragraph, he says, please be diligent in proofreading your reports and avoid the obvious use of canned report templates that do not reflect your thoughts and analysis, as this can affect a judge's interpretation of your report. So, can you imagine that the defense attorney has to ask us as grown adult doctors, most of us are in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, he's asking grown adult doctors to please proofread our reports. Can you believe that? The reason he's found it necessary to ask us to proofread our reports is because qualified medical evaluators oftentimes do not proofread their reports. They use canned report templates that do not reflect your thoughts and analysis. Can you hear the frustration in the voice of the defense attorney through his requests in the cover letter? I'll just read one or two more for you. He says, with regards to the physical examination, your physical examination should document all pertinent negative, all pertinent positive, and all pertinent non-physiologic exam findings. He's asking for the findings of non-physiologic examination maneuvers. He says your conclusions must be supportable and must be based on scientific medical evidence and must be written so that a judge who is a non-medical person may understand them. And doctors, I think this cover letter illustrates the point that the parties, the stakeholders, are the players in the system that use the qualified medical evaluator's reports. And in order for the reports to actually resolve disputed issues in the system, the reports must meet some certain minimum standards. And we talked about those minimum standards in this discussion today. The most important of which is that your opinions and conclusions must qualify as substantial medical evidence. Otherwise, those opinions and conclusions are worthless. So always take your opinions and conclusions, every single opinion and conclusion that you offer in your report, where you're opining on a gray area, always provide compelling and voluminous support for each and every one of those opinions. If you can do this, if you can elevate your opinions and conclusions to the lofty ideal of substantial medical evidence, those opinions and conclusions will be upheld by the parties because those opinions and conclusions are substantial. Okay, so doctors, I hope this helps you. And I realize that writing your reports in this way requires that you develop a new medical decision-making muscle in your brain. You know, I acknowledge that writing QME reports is very, very difficult. and it requires sustained and consecutive deep thought and introspection into your case, and this is not easy to do, and I understand that, and I acknowledge that, and I've been through that myself. But I'm encouraging you in each and every report that you provide that you do your very best, and you stay with it as long as it takes to make it an excellent, high-quality report, which is a report wherein you exactly follow the format that's described by CCR 10606, and then also that you take the time, effort, and mental energy involved in complex medical decision-making to qualify your opinions and conclusions as substantial medical evidence. You know, the parties are a lot like kids. If you have kids, you remember that every time you say something to one of your kids, they always ask you, well, why, Daddy? Well, why, Daddy? Well, why? And the parties want to know why you opine the way you do, so satisfy them with your voluminous and compelling reasons. Okay? Now, in our next session, we're going to close up and conclude this program by going over some actual reports, and I'm going to share with you some errors, omissions, and report writing faux pas, and I'll share with you the fixes on those particular report problems. And then I'm going to provide you the coup de grace, the final conclusion of this program, which is the finished product of the report compliance, credibility, and persuasiveness check sheet, which is a detailed multi-page check sheet that you can use to check your report against each and every time. And the more boxes you can check on the report credibility and persuasiveness check sheet, the better, and higher quality will be the finished product of your QME report. So for today, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for taking the time to commit to excellence in your QME reporting, and look forward to being with you on our very next session as well, as we conclude this program. And for now, I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.